Happy New Year to everybody. I'm Christine Grady. I'm from the Department of Bioethics here at the NIH Clinical Center, and we're going to spend the next hour talking about ethical principles in clinical research. To start, of course, these are mostly my views and don't necessarily represent those of the government, and I have no conflicts of interest that I need to describe. All right, how many of you have studied ethics? Those of you in the room. So a bunch of you have. So this may be very familiar territory. Hopefully you can have some good questions or additions to the commentary. So I wanted to start with just a couple of examples, fairly randomly selected from the New England Journal of Medicine. This is a study, double-blind, placebo-controlled, randomized study of people with traumatic brain injury seen in the emergency room, given progesterone to see if it made a difference in their symptoms and recovery. And this was a study that was done without informed consent. It was done in an emergency room. Here's another example of a study looking at children with vesiculo, I can't say the word, reflux. And again, it was a double-blind, randomized, controlled study to see if antimicrobials made a difference in terms of reflux. There's another study where the participants were pregnant women, and they were randomized to two different time points in terms of thyroid screening, and if they screened positive on the tests that were done, they were given levothyroxine. The primary outcome of the study was cognitive ability, or IQ actually, in their children at the age of 3. So all recently done studies, all published in the New England Journal of Medicine. So I think the interesting question to ask ourselves is, are these studies ethical? And if you think so, or if you're not sure, the question is, how do you make that decision? So just for the people in the room, what do you think makes studies of the nature that I just showed you ethical or not ethical? Any ideas? Informed consent? Okay. So we had TBI patients who couldn't give informed consent, children who legally can't give informed consent. So does that mean 2 of the 3 were not ethical? Not necessarily, right? Okay, risk versus benefit. And we didn't go into the details of those, but we'll talk about that in a little bit. Anything else? Yeah? No actual harm? Okay, so that kind of falls into the rubric of risk versus benefit. Okay, I think it's really interesting to think about what does make research ethical. And so that's what we're going to talk about. I want to point out a couple of things before we go there, though. What I often think of as the inherent moral tension or the ethical tension in research is pretty much captured by this slide. And that is that the goal of research, the goal of clinical research, is to generate knowledge, useful knowledge about human health or illness, ways to prevent, diagnose, or treat diseases. And the goal is not to benefit the individuals who participate in the trial, although sometimes they do benefit. So that sets up this interesting problem ethically, and that is that the people who are asked to participate are actually the means to developing useful information. And therefore, they are at risk of exploitation. And that's really what a lot of the ethics of clinical research is sort of aimed at attending to. We know that sometimes people think of clinical research like this, that people who participate in research are human guinea pigs, that they are susceptible to exploitation and sometimes are exploited. The lay perception of research often is this understanding. But I think it's interesting to think about how we reconcile this. So what I like to say is that the ethics of clinical research really requires recognizing that there are two parts to this puzzle, that generating useful knowledge is an ethical responsibility, and that knowledge can promote benefits to society and to future patients. And that effort of generating useful knowledge for future patients and for society has to be constrained by, or balanced by, if you prefer the analogy, protecting and respecting the rights and welfare of the people who are participating, the participants. And so there's this constant tension between these two, and that's how we think about the ethics of clinical research. Interestingly, over time, over the history of clinical research, there's been interesting changes in how we think about this tension. So for many years, for hundreds of years, there were very few rules. Physicians, mostly physicians, experimented for two reasons. One, because they were curious and they had the luxury or the resources to be able to do so. And two, because they wanted to benefit individuals. They found individuals that they didn't know what to do about in terms of their illnesses, and so they would experiment on them to try to figure out, well, does this work or does it not work? But there were no rules. We went through what people have referred to as a utilitarian era in the United States, maybe in other parts of the world as well, where the emphasis was on benefit to society. And many of the participants in research during that era were people who are now recognized as vulnerable. They were captive populations, people in prisons, people in institutions for the mentally ill, and in orphanages, people who were seen as not only captive, but in some respects sort of marginal to society. And they made them useful by including them in research. Is the sound good? Can you guys hear me okay? Okay. I can't tell. That led in the late 60s, early 70s to a period of time where there was some pretty deep scrutiny of the scope and limitations of research. So studies that you might be familiar with that sort of led to this level of scrutiny. The Tuskegee syphilis study, where all of a sudden people realized, for 40 years we'd been studying the natural history of a disease that had a treatment available to it, and the people in the study were not getting that treatment. Led to a series of congressional hearings, led to an act of Congress called the National Research Act, the creation of a commission, the National Commission for the Protection of Human Subjects of Behavioral and Biomedical Research, and then some rules. And the rules and regulations that we currently operate under were created at that time. They started at that time. And prior to that, there were very few rules about how we did research, or very few laws or regulations that had much authority. The rules and regulations that were put into place starting around the 70s really had the focus or the emphasis of protecting human subjects, providing lots of procedural rules and other rules that would lead to the protection of human subjects from undue risk, as was already pointed out, from exploitation, and would respect their rights through the process of informed consent. In the last probably 20 years or so, there has been increased recognition of the possibility of benefit through participation in research. And this is benefit not just for the individuals, sometimes the individuals who participate, but benefit for populations. So a recognition, for example, that doing research with children sometimes is really important so that we don't end up with therapeutic orphans, children who we don't know how to treat appropriately for certain diseases. Whereas if we don't include them for research, in clinical practice, we're making guesses about how to treat children. So having children participate in research is a benefit to children at large. International research has been seen in some cases as beneficial. And there's lots of ways that research has been seen as not just something to be protected against, but beneficial in some ways. During this same period of history, and I just went through a lot of history in about very short amount of time. I can answer questions if you want more details. But during the same stretch of history, there are lots of important codes and guidelines that were written and are still have some power. And I suspect that many of these are familiar to you. The Nuremberg Code was the code that was written as part of the Nuremberg trials of the Nazi war crimes, and still has some influence in terms of how we do research in the world, not just in the United States. It's a very succinct code of 10 principles. The Declaration of Helsinki, which came along about 15 years later, was written by the World Medical Association, which is a sort of group of like the American Medical Association and its equivalents in different countries around the world. And they wrote a document called the Declaration of Helsinki, which was, some people say, in a little bit of a way, a response to Nuremberg, but a response in the following sense, that it recognized that a lot of research is done by physicians with patients, whereas the Nuremberg Code was written as a result of research that was done with prisoners in the context of war. The Declaration of Helsinki is, as people describe it, a living document. It's been revised multiple times. This slide needs to be updated. It was most recently revised in 2013. And it has a lot of very important pieces to it and a lot of authority around the world. And I can talk about what those are if you want to know. The Belmont Report is a document that was written by the National Commission that I mentioned a few minutes ago. And it's a pretty short, pretty clear explication of the principles that underlie the conduct of clinical research. And I'm going to come back to that in a moment. If you haven't read that, I would say take the time to do so. It's not very long. CIOMS and the WHO, CIOMS is the Council of International Organizations of Medical Sciences, and they, in collaboration with the World Health Organization, developed international guidelines which were designed to take the principles enunciated in the Declaration of Helsinki and apply them to the context of doing research in the developing world. And there are two published versions of those guidelines, 1993 and 2002, and just in the last few months, a revised version is online for people to comment on. And so if you're interested in international research in particular, it's worth looking at. One of the things that I really like about the CIOMS document is that in addition to principles, which many of these have, it has clear, detailed explications of how they came up with that principle and what they mean by it. So it's very useful. And the ICH-GCP is a very influential document in the world. It's a International Conference on Harmonization, Good Clinical Practice, which originally came about through the regulatory agencies of the United States, the European Union, and Japan, who wanted to find a way to agree on or harmonize the rules under which clinical research could be done, so that if you did research in one of those jurisdictions and wanted to have it approved in the other jurisdiction, you'd have to start all over again, which is what a lot of countries do require. So ICH-GCP has now been adopted by a number of countries around the world, and it allows for this regulatory reciprocity, if that's the way you think about it. In terms of E6 is the part of the ICH-GCP that speaks specifically to ethics, and it does adopt most of the principles from the Declaration of Helsinki. So you can see lots of interaction with these documents. So the Belmont Report I mentioned is a document that was written by the National Commission, and it has three underlying principles for clinical research: respect for persons, beneficence, and justice. And in the Belmont Report, they take each of these and not only describe what they mean by it, but they also apply it to a specific aspect of doing clinical research. So probably, especially those of you who have ever studied ethics, these are principles that are commonly discussed that don't just apply to clinical research. They apply to lots of things. But in the context of clinical research, the Commission applied respect for persons to the idea of informed consent. They applied beneficence to the idea of risk-benefit assessment and how you make those calculations. and justice to the idea of fairly selecting subjects so that there are fair outcomes as well. The other important thing I think that the Belmont report did is it described a distinction between clinical research and clinical practice. And this is useful for thinking about the ethics of clinical research to sort of make these kinds of distinctions. So one thing that I've already alluded to is the goals. So the goal of clinical research is to generate useful knowledge. The goal of clinical care is not to do that. It's to benefit the person or persons in front of you, the persons that are being cared for in a practice. And you can see how sometimes those two goals can come into tension and need to be reconciled. Methods are also very different. So common methods in clinical research. We talked about double-blind trials, placebo-controlled trials, dose escalation trials. The kinds of things that we do all the time in research are very foreign concepts in clinical practice. So it would be very weird for you to go to your doctor with a sore throat and have the doctor say to you, I'm going to give you one of two drugs, but neither you nor I are going to know what the drug is to heal your sore throat. And yet in research we do that all the time. The other important difference from an ethical perspective is the justification for risks. So it's clearly not the case that in clinical practice there are no risks involved. There are certainly risks in taking medications and having surgeries and interventions, et cetera. But all of those risks are justified by the potential for the benefit that intervention offers to the individual who's undergoing it. Whereas in research, we often ask people to do certain things, procedures or interventions, that have no corresponding benefit to them, but they're being done to answer a question. So we might ask for an extra biopsy, an extra blood draw, an extra scan, a pharmacokinetic test, something like that exposes people to certain risks for the purpose of answering an important scientific question, but not for their benefit. And so there's three ways that research and clinical research and clinical practice are distinguished, and they're very important to keep in mind because they help us answer a lot of questions about what's acceptable and what's not. And the Belmont report begins to describe those differences. In addition to codes and guidelines, there are regulations. Okay, so in the United States, there are two important sets of regulations that are worth knowing about. One is the Common Rule. How many of you know about the Common Rule? A couple people. Okay, not everybody. Okay, the Common Rule is let me start with US 45 CFR 46. Also, walking around the halls of this building, sometimes you hear people just talk about it like that. They don't call it the Common Rule. They call it 45 CFR 46. And so the 45 CFR 46 is Title 45 of the Code of Federal Regulations, Part 46. And it is the Department of Health and Human Services version of the Common Rule, the regulations for protection of human subjects that anyone getting Department of Health and Human Services money has to follow. The reason it's called the Common Rule is that there are 16 other federal agencies that also follow the same set of regulations. Their regulations are found in different parts of the CFR, not all in Title 45, that's DHHS, but the content of the rule and the regulations is similar across 16 other federal agencies in the United States. One of the agencies that does not follow the Common Rule is FDA. And FDA has its own set of regulations. The regulations that are found at Title 21 of the CFR and at Part 50 and 56 are very similar to what's in the Common Rule, have a lot of the same requirements, but some important differences. And then there are other parts of the FDA regulations that are very important for somebody who's doing a treatment IND, for example, or a device trial. And then there are policies and guidelines that the NIH requires. So, for example, how many of you are investigators? A couple, okay. So if how many of you are IRB members? Anybody? No. Okay. There are some requirements for inclusion of women and ethnic minorities and children in research that are NIH requirements, but that are requirements, I guess is the way I would say it. And there are some others that the NIH has that are NIH policy that apply to clinical research. So what does 45 CFR 46 include? There are really three things that are there. There's a lot more than this. There's federal regulations are, I don't know how many pages, 15 pages or something of details. And so if you are on an IRB or if you're getting ready to write a study, you might really want to know about what the details are. But basically, they cover three broad areas. One is a lot of description about the composition and function of local institutional review boards, or IRBs. Another is the criteria that IRBs should use when they're deciding whether or not a study is approvable. And the third is requirements regarding informed consent of individuals that are going to be included in the study. So these are spelled out in the Common Rule and also in 45 CFR 46. 45 CFR 46 also has subparts that pertain to additional protections for groups of people that are considered vulnerable for a variety of reasons. So subpart B refers to fetuses, pregnant women, and human in vitro fertilization, C to prisoners, and D to children. And there are some very specific additional requirements that research with these populations entails. The FDA regs, I already mentioned that the 21 CFR 50 and 56 are very similar to what's found in the Common Rule. The Part 50 is about informed consent. Part 56 is about IRB composition and function. There is also a subpart D in the FDA regs that deals with extra protections for research with children. And then there are IND and IDE regulations found at 312 and 812 that are very important if you're an investigator who's testing a new investigational new drug or device. So that's a whirlwind through a little bit of history and a little bit of the rules and regulations that exist. What I want to spend the rest of the time talking with you about are some sort of conceptual ideas about how you think about research in a way that helps you answer the questions of, is this research ethical? And I want to preface it by saying that, in our department some 15 or so years ago now, we realized that a lot of the guidance that's found in the codes and the regulations were developed in response to specific problems. So they were developed historically at a time that they were responding to some event that happened in history. And so they understandably kind of focused on what the sort of details of that event that initiated their implementation. In addition to, or for the same reason perhaps, some issues are probably incompletely addressed in some of these guidances, and some of the guidances and regulations are at least interpreted to have divergent recommendations, to not agree on specific things. So we thought that there was a need for investigators, for people who are interested in understanding the ethics of research, for people who review research, IRB members and others, to have a systematic, coherent, and universally applicable framework that they could use to make decisions about or make judgments about whether or not a particular research that they were writing or reviewing was ethical. And so we proposed a 7-principle framework. And the 7 principles, and it's published in a couple of different places. The first paper was in 2000 in JAMA. It's also in a textbook. There's some additions to this in the international context. So there's a number of references that I could provide for you if you want that explicate this pretty in some detail. But I'm going to go through it today. So there's 7 principles. They include valuable scientific question, valid scientific methodology, fair subject selection, favorable risk-benefit evaluation, independent review, informed consent, and respect for enrolled subjects. One thing before I go into each one of them I want to say is we didn't make any of these up. So if you look at the various guidelines and codes, you will find vestiges of each of these, maybe not exact words, these exact words, but the concepts and the ideas are there. We've just put them together in a way that seemed more systematic to us. And what I mean by that is that it seems right that you have to start at the top. You have to answer the question, is this a valuable scientific question, before you go down the list. And so, you know, the question of informed consent is on there. It's a very important part of doing research. But you don't even get near it until you've gone through lots of other considerations in terms of a project. So what does it mean to have a valuable scientific question? So basically what this means is that it has to be worth doing, if that's a sort of shorthand for it. An ethical clinical research should answer a valuable question, one that will generate new knowledge or understanding about human health or illness that's socially, clinically, or scientifically useful. So a good example of this is an article that was written by a very prolific writer in research ethics, Benjamin Friedman, who wrote an article about, in this article he was writing about social value in a certain way. And what he said was he had a nightmare where he was walking down the hall and he ran into one of his colleagues who excitedly came to him and said, "I just successfully transplanted an appendix." And in the article, Benji says he kind of scratched his head and he said, "Well, was that ethical?" And his colleague responded, "Well, I got the guy's informed consent." And he uses that as an example of how informed consent doesn't solve the problem. If there wasn't a good reason, a good question to answer by transplanting an appendix, something that you might learn, something that you might use to do some important work with, then it wasn't ethical to do it. And it's an interesting concept because it seems like it is the most important first question to ask. Is this research worth doing? Now, importantly, it doesn't mean that the answer to the question has to be positive. You can have negative, ask a question, get negative answers, and that's still socially valuable. It still gives you information that can be very useful, and in many cases is. But if you can't say why this question is worth asking, then you probably have to re-ask yourself, is this research ethical? There are many reasons that social value is important. It promotes benefit to society, so the sort of one side of the balance that I showed you before. And it also minimizes exploitation. You're asking people to do things for a good reason, not just wasting their time for nothing. Therefore, it justifies asking them to accept some risk and burden. And it's also a responsible way to use resources. The second principle in the framework is valid scientific methodology. And this basically says ethical research should be designed in a methodologically rigorous manner. The design, the methods, the statistical power, etc., that will yield valid, reliable, generalizable, and interpretable data. So the shorthand here is you have a question that's worth asking. The second ethical requirement is to design it in a way that you get an answer that you can interpret, that you know what you found, that you have data that's reasonably understandable. Again, doesn't have to be positive, just has to be understandable. And it has to be designed in a way that's feasible as well. Now, this requires lots of details in terms of choices of endpoints, choices of designs, choices of procedures, statistical methods, etc. And you look at this list, and some of you might say, well, those are all scientific considerations. And in fact, they are scientific considerations, but every scientific choice that you make has ethical implications. And so designing your study, picking the right outcomes, picking the right design to give you the best, most rigorous answer to your question, choosing the procedures that will be used to measure outcomes or data points or whatever, and not only planning your statistical methods but managing your data well, are all ethical requirements in terms of good clinical research. There's lots of controversies about this. Not so much about the idea that things need to be designed in a way that give you a rigorous answer, but how do you balance the best design, the most rigorous design, with some of the other things that you need to care about, like the fact that you don't want to exploit people or expose them to excessive risk. So some of you may have followed the debates that occurred over clinical trials related to Ebola in the last year. And there were a lot of discussions about, what's the right kind of design that both gives us an answer to the questions that are so urgently needed to be answered and respects the rights and the welfare of the participants that are in these trials. There's also a lot of really important ethical weight that goes into feasibility. So if you're, for example, imagine designing a trial where you're not going to be able to get the participants that you need to answer it. That's sort of ethically a non-starter, because you can't ask some people to accept risk and burden to answer a question that you're not going to be able to answer, because it's not feasible to get all the people that you need, or to get the equipment that you need, or to have the right freezer capabilities, or whatever. There could be lots of details in terms of feasibility. The third is fair subject selection. So you have a question that's worth answering, a design and methodology that's rigorous, and it's going to give you an answer that you can make sense out of. Now you have to ask the question, who do I include? Who do I go after to be part of this study? And I think critically, especially looking historically, the first guide should be scientific objectives. That the scientific objectives of the study guide the inclusion criteria, the recruitment strategies, and the selection of subjects, and not the fact that people are easily available or vulnerable or marginal, or that they are privileged either. That there needs to be a fairness in terms of scientific objectives. Scientific objectives is where you start, and then when you're thinking about fair subject selection, there's also a consideration of fairly distributing the harms and benefits. So let me give you an example. Let's imagine you think you're doing a study to test a treatment for breast cancer. Scientifically, you're going to need people in that study who have breast cancer, and maybe a very specific type of breast cancer. When you're thinking about fairly distributing the harms and the benefits, you may think about, well, which subgroups within the population of people have breast cancer are more susceptible to the kinds of risks that this intervention might have. Maybe kidney disease or liver disease, or some kinds of things that might need to be used as exclusion criteria in order to reduce the risks and protect some of the subgroups. One of my colleagues talks about the best way to think about fair subject selection is to flip it on its head. In other words, not start with who scientifically should you include in this study, but start with the idea that everybody should be included unless there's a reason to exclude them, a justification for excluding them. And so then the question becomes, what are acceptable justifications for excluding people? Well, one might be that they can't help answer the question. They don't meet the scientific objectives. Another might be that they are at higher risk than everybody else who could meet these scientific objectives. And a third, and a very important one, is that they may be more vulnerable than other populations, and therefore we should think about whether we need to include them at the front end. I understand there will be another lecture, a whole lecture on vulnerability, so I won't say more about that, but if you have questions, we can talk about that. I think it's important to go back to something I've already alluded to, and that is in thinking about distributing or fair distribution of the risks and benefits, it's important to keep in mind this sort of pendulum swing that's been occurring between thinking of research as always a burden and subjects as always in need of protection, and the sort of opposite swing of the pendulum where research can be or is, in many cases, a benefit, and subjects need and want access to participation. And so thinking about the risks and benefits, you need to keep in mind those different poles and where any particular project might fall in that spectrum. So you've got a question worth asking, a design that's rigorous, selected the appropriate population given scientific objectives and risk and benefit and vulnerability. And now the question is, what's the risk-benefit look like for the participants in the study? So this is a sort of different kind of risk-benefit analysis than the first one, which is a study worth doing? In a study that's worth doing, there are still ways that one can make sure that the risks to the individuals in the study are minimized and necessary. So you may see a proposal, for example, that asks to do, 10 MRIs over the course of 6 months. And so an interesting question to ask is, are 10 necessary? Or could the question be answered by doing 6 or 5 or, spreading them out over a further amount of time? Are there other ways to minimize the burden of those procedures to the participants? Are the risks to the individuals in the study justified by either benefit to them or potential benefit to them, or the importance of the knowledge, the social value? And are benefits enhanced? Are there ways to enhance benefits in the process of doing research? And these are, you might say, well, these are pretty normal, understandable questions, no big deal. But the process of doing that is not so straightforward. I mean, just thinking about risks, for example, there's a very interesting challenge in terms of defining what is a risk in research. What counts as a research risk? How do we know how bad this risk is, or how to think about this risk on some kind of a scale? And there are certainly lots of reasons to think about both probability and magnitude of risk and different types of risk. So one of the things that the regulations talk about is physical, psychological, social, financial risks. It's interesting to think about how often in research we consider financial risks as an example. Some people talk about, or I've had questions raised that fall in the following sort of category. If somebody has to travel through a very tough neighborhood or park really far away from the clinic and walk to the clinic, and there's some hazards in that walk, are those risks of research, or are those separate from the risks of research? How do we take those things into account when we're making an assessment of what the risks are? And I think importantly, in all cases of research, there is some uncertainty about risks. And if there wasn't some uncertainty about risks, we probably wouldn't be doing the research, because part of doing research is helping to identify either what the risks are, the magnitude of the risks, the comparative risks, or some other nuance about the risks. So defining risks and measuring risks is a very important part of figuring this out, but is not easy in many cases. Minimizing risks is also something that we need to pay attention to, and some things are very straightforward. I mentioned already, reducing the number of procedures if you can and still get an answer. Other things that people talk about are, doing procedures that are clinically required, and in other words, instead of asking for additional blood for research purposes, have it drawn at the time when clinical bloods are being drawn. Making sure that the people who are doing procedures have the right kind of training. That's a way to minimize risk. So there are lots of really important, sometimes very obvious ways to minimize risk. And limiting risk really gets down to how we protect certain groups of people. So one of the ways, for example, that the regulations regarding research with children work is that it limits the amount of risk that children can be exposed to in research. Minimal risk procedures in research for children are generally fine. More risk can be accepted when there's a prospect of benefit for the children in the study. And then the rules for anything more than a minimal risk without a prospect of benefit in children are much more stringent, and in some cases research cannot be done. There's also similar challenges in terms of defining benefits. What is a prospect of benefit in research? If you have a certain kind of serious illness and there are few interventions available to treat that illness, and you are entering a study in which there's an intervention being offered, is that by definition a prospect of benefit? Is it only a prospect of benefit if we already know something about the drug? If it's in phase 3 versus phase 1, for example? How do we decide what's a prospect of benefit in certain cases? And a lot of discussion about distinguishing what are called direct benefits versus secondary or sometimes ancillary benefits. So the direct benefits are, maybe the therapeutic possible therapeutic benefit that one might derive from an intervention. The secondary benefits might be other medical care that you might receive as part of the study, payment that you might receive as part of a study, feeling like you're contributing to society that might be psychologically beneficial as part of a study. Those are generally considered secondary benefits. So importantly, and going back to my original balancing scale, the most guidance recognizes that interests other than the subject, those of the subject, may on some occasions be sufficient by themselves to justify risks. What this basically means is that research in which we know in advance the individuals who are participating will not benefit, there's no prospect of benefit, can sometimes be ethically acceptable as long as the rights of the individuals who are participants have been adequately protected. So, a question worth asking, a design that's rigorous, the right population chosen, efforts made to minimize risks and enhance benefits. Now, the next thing on that list is independent review. And so this is a process which allows an investigator or a research team who has investments in research to have somebody else say, is this acceptable? To ensure that the ethical requirements have been filled, check any biases that the investigator might bring, and assure the public that research is not exploiting individuals or groups. And so most research in the United States is independently reviewed by institutional review boards, or IRBs. There is research that's exempt from IRB review and expedited through IRB review, so there are other methods of reviewing. Most countries around the world have an equivalent kind of ethics research review committee that does looks at research before it starts, research with humans. And the criteria that are found in both the Common Rule and in the FDA regulations that the IRB is supposed to use in order to determine whether a particular study is approvable include these. And you'll see flavors of things that I've already talked about. That risks are minimized. There's more to that statement than I put on the slide. That risks are justified by any anticipated benefits to the subjects or the importance of the knowledge. That subjects will be selected and treated fairly, and that informed consent is adequate. There are lots of interesting and sort of in the news challenges right now with IRB review. One is many IRBs have huge volume of protocols to review. So how many of you have ever been to an IRB meeting? Anybody? Only one. Okay, 2. Okay. So oftentimes an IRB meetings can last 4 hours, but you have, maybe 10 protocols to review. Some of them, protocols sometimes are, 300 pages long and dense in terms of their scientific background, et cetera. So the challenge is not trivial in terms of understanding what it's about, having a process of asking questions often of the investigator, and then applying these principles and thinking about, well, is this something that's approvable in its current form or does it need to be changed? Consequently, there's been plenty of evidence to show that IRBs tend to be inconsistent in terms of how they make their judgments. And this is created problems in particular for multi-center studies or multi-site studies. So if you have a study that has 100 different sites, oftentimes 100 different IRBs have to review it, and they may have either grossly different decisions or sometimes just mildly different decisions, but that impact the entire spectrum of sites that are conducting the study. So this is a problem that a lot of people have talked about, and lots of attention right now to using single IRB review for multi-site studies. This year, in September of 2015, the Department of Health and Human Services published what's called a Notice of Proposed Rulemaking. That's what NPRM stands for. Maybe some of you have heard about it. And basically, it's a proposal for changing the common rule. And there's some very interesting, some minor and some huge changes in terms of what they're proposing. One of them is this, that for multi-center studies that are domestic, not international, a single IRB review will be required. They won't be able to have different institutions doing IRBs, reviewing different institutions' IRBs reviewing the study, but only one will be able to do it. And there's a lot of consternation about how this is going to look and whether it will work and whether it will be adequately protective and how you'll make arrangements between institutions and lots of details. So the sixth of the 7 on our list is informed consent. And as someone in the audience said, a lot of people, when they think about, sort of abstractly, what is it that makes research ethical, clinical research ethical? The answer often is informed consent. And certainly in most cases, informed consent is an important part of doing ethical research. But what's interesting about it is if you think about it, until you have a proposal that's worth doing and well designed and you've minimized risks and had somebody else review it, there is no reason to ask anybody for their informed consent. You don't even get there until you've gone through those other steps. But informed consent, once you're there, has a goal of making sure that the people that you're offering participation to have an opportunity to decide whether they want to participate or continue to participate and whether or not participating is compatible with their goals and their interests and their values. So it's a really important concept. Most of the documents, the codes, guidelines, regulations, have something related to informed consent in them, and some of them are very strong. So Nuremberg Code is famously quoted as saying the voluntary consent of human subjects is absolutely essential. SIOMS says, for all biomedical research involving human subjects, the investigator must obtain the informed consent of the prospective subject or an authorized representative. And the regulations have pretty much language that's very similar to this as well. There are some exceptions. There are some ways to waive informed consent. Emergencies are one example. So the study I showed you at the beginning, where you're encountering and doing an intervention on people in the emergency room who have traumatic brain injury. There's a process that's regulatorily described that one needs to go through in order to do that, but those kinds of research can sometimes be done without getting the consent of the individuals who are in a position, for the most part, to not be able to give informed consent. So I will skip that one. So what does informed consent involve? It involves a number of steps: disclosure of information to people, often, usually, written and oral. Some sense that they understand the information well enough to be able to make a decision, a choice that they can make, which is hopefully voluntary, in other words, not coerced or unduly influenced by others or other factors, and then they authorize it. And I don't know if you can see my picture, but it's a cartoon which is not really that funny. People standing around a table looking at a guy who's being asked to sign consent, and you can see them with their trench coats and their hats and putting a lot of pressure on this poor guy who's sweating. Unfortunately, sometimes informed consent in clinical research does look like that or feels like that to people. And other times it's done, in a very open and iterative way so that people really can engage with the information, ask questions, understand it, and make a decision. There are lots of challenges to this. You can tell I spend a lot of time thinking about informed consent. Some of my research is on informed consent. But just for example, think about how many of you have seen consent forms that are used in the intramural program? Have any of you seen them? Okay. And so oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes the consent form in the intramural program is 15, 18 pages long. Those are long documents for people to read. Choices about what to put in those consent documents and how to say things are really very ethically important and very difficult, to be able to give people the information they need without making it so long and so cumbersome that they can't read it or they can't absorb it. And then the IRB has an important role in reviewing consent, both the plan for informing participants about the various aspects of the study, how investigators or the research team is going to know whether or not somebody understands, and whether their choice is voluntary. So the seventh of our 7 principle framework is what we called respect for enrolled subjects. And this is an element or a principle that I think really needs some more work. And the reason let me say where it came from first and then say why I think it needs more work. So in reviewing the documents, the codes of ethics, the literature on research ethics, the regulations, they all talk about what you do up front. You get review, you make sure the risks and benefits are justified and risks are minimized, and get the person's informed consent. And then the study begins. And much of the guidance, not all of it, but much of the guidance doesn't say much else about what happens. And that doesn't make any sense, right? Your ethical obligations to people that you're enrolling in research can't end the minute you get their informed consent, right? You still have obligations to people. And so these obligations include at least things like protecting their confidentiality, monitoring their welfare, recognizing that they have a right to withdraw, providing them new information as it becomes available that might affect their decision to participate, informing them of new findings, planning for what happens at the end of the trial. There are other things that are not on this list. Compensation for research-related injury. There are a lot of things that people do talk about that are sort of under this rubric of what happens after the study begins. And so I think hopefully you can see why this is an important element, but also you can see why there needs to be more work on this, because some of these things are sort of done without a lot of guidance. There is some guidance. So, for example, in the Nuremberg Code, it says during the course of the experiment, the subject should be at liberty to bring the experiment to an end, so can withdraw at any time. And Helsinki talks about privacy and confidentiality and minimizing the impact of the study on a person's physical and mental integrity. So those are the 7. Hopefully they made some sense. I think importantly, again, I've said this, but we think of them as systematic and sequential. So you start at the top and work your way down, and that they're necessary so that when you're thinking about a study, whether you're writing it or reviewing it or thinking about entering it as a participant, it's worth thinking them through one at a time and saying, okay, does this study have value? Is it well designed? Are the right people being asked to participate? Are the inclusion criteria right? Are the risks minimized? Has it been reviewed by an IRB? Is there a good process in place for informed consent? And are all the things that happen to people once the study starts, the monitoring, the confidentiality, the plans for what happens at the end, are those all adequate? And you can ask those questions for every single study that you consider in any way. It also seems important to recognize that these can be universal. In other words, they apply to all studies everywhere across time. What's important, however, is thinking about how they're actually manifested. So risks, for example, might vary from over time, from one time point to another, or from one geographic location to another. The method by which you disclose information in the process of informed consent might vary by population, appropriately so. Doesn't mean informed consent, the principle of giving people information that they can use to make a decision changes. It's how you implement it that changes from study to study. And of course, they're going to require some balancing and specifying. So the idea of, having an adequate justification for the risks requires a lot of specification in terms of determining what are the risks, what are the risks that count in this case, how do we balance them with the benefits, what are the benefits that count in this case, how do we weigh them, how do we balance them against the rigor of the study. And there are a lot of interesting examples of challenges, for example, in randomized controlled trials. People worry about things like randomizing people, especially if one of the arms to which people might be randomized is a placebo arm. People worry about that from an ethical perspective, and yet if the question is worth asking and the design is rigorous, it might be that placebo is the best way to answer the question, and not only the best way to answer the question, but the fairest thing for the individuals, because if you know up front that the drug is much better than placebo, then maybe you shouldn't be doing the study. So it's that kind of balancing that needs to be done. And, in order to apply those principles and reconcile the inherent conflicts and make informed judgments about ethical research, we need people who are investigators and research teams and IRB members and statisticians and ethicists, et cetera, who have this kind of information and can use this kind of a framework to make decisions. So hopefully all of you will be able to find it useful in whatever work you do. I want to end with just a minute or two about some interesting challenges that are going on that people have cited as, some of this I've actually already referred to in terms of the NPRM and the proposals for changing the common rule. But certain ways that we do research now that were not envisioned when some of the regulations and codes of ethics were written. And so people are beginning to question, do we have the right set of guidance in terms of doing research? I think the 7 principles that I just described are very useful in thinking through these new challenges in research. But for example, more and more of the research that's being done is multi-site and also multinational. So you have differences between sites, differences between countries that make very important challenges in terms of how to do something right that's also scientifically rigorous. And I've already mentioned the IRB challenges in terms of multiple sites. There's been a lot of attention in the last couple of years to learning healthcare systems, quality improvement research, comparative effectiveness research, some people call usual care research or standard of care research, and questions related to whether or not these all are similar to the sort of clinical trial paradigm that the rules and the regulations and the guidance was written about. And there are huge debates in the literature. Maybe some of you have heard about the support study that occurred a couple of years ago, and there's still people writing about the support study in terms of whether or not we have the right paradigm for thinking about research ethics. We're also in the middle of lots of debates about research using data and samples or biospecimens. The Notice of Proposed Rulemaking, the NPRM, has some major changes in terms of how we do research with biospecimens and data from how we currently do research with biospecimens and data. And so there are lots of discussions about whether or not the NPRM proposals are correct and how they're going to change how we do research. And certainly much attention in the last couple of years to genomic data collecting genomic data and sharing genomic data. And one of the other NIH policies that's very influential in terms of research is the genomic data sharing policy, which requires NIH-funded investigators that do genomic research to share their data and deposit it in a government repository. So lots of interesting challenges in these changing landscapes. And this last slide is just a link to some more information that you might find useful. So questions, comments, challenges? Nothing. Clear as mud. For those of you who studied ethics in the past, did this add anything to your knowledge base, or was it repetitious? Didn't hear anything? It added? Okay, at least one added. Nobody has any questions? Any cases you want to raise? Things you've been wondering about? Did you have a question?
In layman's terms, is there anything about benchmarking people's conditions before they enter into a study?
What do you mean by benchmarking?
Assessing their general, overall, whatever characteristics of what the study is addressing.
Well, if I understand what you mean correctly, most of the time, especially for studies that involve interventions, there's a pretty thorough history and physical done and a careful assessment of whether each individual meets the inclusion and criteria that are specified to protect people in that study. And then a series of data points at which different measurements are taken to see how the individual is or is not responding to the intervention, which includes not only measures of efficacy, if you will, but also safety, what kinds of toxicities, side effects, et cetera. So those are, in research, especially research with interventions, those are very carefully monitored, those kinds of things. So is that what you had in mind?
Is there a relationship to all of the consent or contractually if some damage is done?
Yeah. So that's a good question. So it is the nature of the beast that we don't know the full effects of things that we're trying in research, which is really why we're doing them, right? Why we're trying something, and why we are monitoring so closely and watching people. And almost every study that you might encounter has what they call stopping rules, which are both for individuals. If individuals experience this kind of side effect or this level of side effect, they will be taken out of the study, or their dose will be adjusted or held for a while. And there are also stopping rules usually for the entire study. If 2 people have this or 4 people have this kind of level of side effect, then the study will be changed or stopped or things like that. So those kinds of safeguards are built into studies all the time. However, there's another issue that I think you're raising, and that is, what if somebody is hurt? And it is one of the more controversial areas in research ethics, I think, and that is that in the United States, anyway, we do not have a requirement for or a system for compensating people who are hurt in research, who are injured in research. What we do have is a regulation that requires investigators to tell people what will happen if they get hurt in research. And so consent forms often have language that says something like, if you are injured as part of this research, or if you are hurt as part of this research, we will take care of you for a short term, or we will transfer you to someplace else that will be able to take care of you, but your insurance company will pay for that. So we don't have a good system. And that's something that's been it has been contentious, because most people who think about it for more than a few minutes think, that's a mistake. We ought to have a system in place for helping people who are hurt. There's lots of literature on that if that's something of interest to you. Other questions? Well then, go forth and be ethical. And remember, we have if you're all intramural here, we have a Department of Bioethics which offers consults and classes, and we have ethics grand rounds every 4 times a year. Some of them are great case-based discussions, so please take advantage of us. And thank you for your attention.